Welcome back, beloved friends. I'm Ilara, known by my community here in Harvest Creek, Oklahoma, as just Ilara. I'm 75 now, and this kitchen, my sanctuary, is the heart of my world. You can almost smell the yeast and cinnamon from my morning baking when you step inside. This is where I make my famous apple pie for the market, where my own grandchildren gather around the old pine table. It's a warm, bustling place, filled with the scent of safety and good food. Yet this very room, this hearth, was once the center of a nightmare, a place where fear was seasoned into every meal. Before I pour us a second cup of coffee, I need to share a memory that is sharp and clear today as the dust in a summer wind. It's the story of my 17th birthday and the quiet, deliberate act of making a final, perfectly crafted meal. That morning, I served a man, my own father, his last taste of freedom. Within minutes, the sound of the front door was replaced by the click of steel handcuffs. It was the end of a long, silent captivity and the beginning of a life I earned with courage. To understand why a simple meal became an instrument of justice, we have to go back to 1950, to this little plot of land, then just a dirt-poor farmstead. My father, Silas Sterling, was a figure of authority in our town. He was an imposing man who ran the local dry goods store, selling everything from seeds to sundries. The town saw him as a hard-working pillar of the community, always quick with a hearty handshake and a smile. But behind the curtain of the back porch, where our small 3-room cottage sat, a different kind of man lived. My mother, Beatrice, was a ghost in her own home, constantly tending to Silas's needs, her eyes always downcast. She taught me to cook when I was barely big enough to reach the counter, saying a woman must always be able to feed herself. Now I understand she was giving me the tools for survival. She appeared with unexplained bruises, cuts she blamed on dropped dishes, and an eternal look of quiet desperation. His drinking made the nights a terror. I'd hide under my covers, listening to his rants and the crash of objects, a sound that always preceded my mother's soft, frightened apologies. Then one morning, when I was 9, she was gone, leaving behind only a whisper of a farewell note under my thin pillow, a plea for forgiveness I would only understand years later. That day, the sun rose on a world where I, a 9-year-old girl, was suddenly alone with a monster. I had unknowingly inherited my mother's post, but Silas would ensure I learned my duties with swift, brutal clarity. The fear that had been my mother's shadow now fell fully over me. The house became silent, but the silence was deafening. I was now the sole keeper of the hearth, and my father's instruction did not begin with a kind word, but with a slap that sent me sprawling across the cold linoleum floor. If you think my mother's life was hard, you must hear what came next.
The moment my mother, Beatrice, fled Harvest Creek, my father, Silas, began what he chillingly called my education. The very first day, he came home to an empty pot, and when I, tear-streaked and confused, told him I didn't know how to cook a full meal yet, he backhanded me across the face. His lesson was simple. I want hot food on that table, and in this house, you will obey without question. At 9 years old, my childhood ended, replaced by a rigid routine of housework and fear. My days were spent scrubbing the floors of the cottage, washing his work shirts by hand and struggling to manage the heavy iron pots on the wood-burning stove. Failure was not an option. It was grounds for immediate and painful correction. I remember one terrible afternoon around age 11 when I ruined the evening's corn pudding. The sickly sweet smell of scorched food filled the small kitchen. Silas came in, nostrils flared like a predator scenting weakness. Before I could offer an apology or a fix, he was unbuckling his wide leather belt. He said that wasting food was a sin, and sin was paid for in pain. The blows were relentless. He would order me to stop crying, telling me to learn to be strong. But all I learned was how to scream silently inside my own head. As the years passed, the control grew absolute. I was forbidden from leaving the property without his permission. If a neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, tried to exchange a word with me over the fence, he'd be waiting to hiss his warning. Decent women don't stand on the street talking to just anyone. The house became my cage. But when I turned 13, the atmosphere in our small home darkened from mere control to something more deeply, sickeningly wrong. My body was changing, and his gaze changed with it. He began watching me with an unsettling intensity, making comments about my height and shape that made my skin crawl. I started wearing my mother's old, oversized aprons, anything to hide from those leering eyes. He would sit there, whiskey breath heavy in the air, telling me he had to keep a close watch, claiming the men in this town are all predators. But the only predator was the man sitting across the table. Then came the spring of 1963. I was 16, and a young man named Aaron, who worked at the mill, merely waved to me from the road as I swept the porch. Silas must have been watching from the store window. He rushed inside, his face purple with rage, and dragged me from the kitchen. He screamed, calling me trash for inviting attention, then did something he had never done before. He locked me in my tiny room from the outside. I heard the bolt slide, a sound that sealed my fate. It was no longer a home, it was a prison. The sound of that exterior bolt turning was the soundtrack to my new life. Every night, I would lie in the darkness, listening to his heavy footsteps, knowing that the man sworn to protect me was actively keeping me locked away. I was now a prisoner in a house where my captor was also my father, and the worst was yet to come.
With the bolt on my door, my imprisonment became a waking hell. Silas now woke me before dawn with a shouted insult, demanding I start the chores before the sun was up. The lock clicking at night was my sentence. One brutal winter, I caught a severe fever. I could barely move, shivering so hard my teeth chattered, but when I tried to explain, he snarled, accusing me of faking illness to escape work. He hauled me to the stove, forcing me to cook until I dropped a heavy pot of beans, scattering the meal all over the cold, dirty floor. He then forced me to spend an hour on my hands and knees, picking up every single bean, saying this was God's punishment for being a disobedient daughter. As I recovered, gaunt and weak, his disturbing attention escalated. His words became thinly veiled threats, and he would often stare at me, drunk, comparing me to my mother, warning that I would never abandon him. I became obsessed with disappearing, trying to become invisible by hiding behind the largest, plainest clothes I could find. I tried to tell people. I truly did. At church, I cornered Pastor Davies, a kindly man who knew our family well. As I stood before him, my heart pounding, the words dissolved into dust in my mouth. I could only manage a shaky lie. I just feel lonely since my mother left. The pastor, seeing only a shy, sad girl, gave me a blessing and a platitude about burdens, completely missing the terror screaming behind my eyes. I also tried with Mrs. Olson, the milliner who made hats in town. When she asked about my pallor, I hinted at my misery, but she dismissed it as difficult teenage moodiness. They only saw what they wanted, the successful merchant and his quiet, dutiful daughter. The well of hope dried up. I lived on autopilot, a ghost in my own house, considering dark escapes I should never have had to face. The ultimate line was crossed one cold autumn night in 1963. He came home staggeringly drunk, the foul stench of whiskey choking the kitchen air. I was washing dishes when he lurched behind me, his voice thick and possessive. His grip on my arm was painful, leaving marks that would last for weeks. He declared himself my owner, screaming that I belonged to him. That night, Silas ensured I would never feel like a child again. Life became a silent endurance, and I realized my mother hadn't abandoned me. She had fled to survive. My fear solidified into an icy resolve. The cycle had to stop. The pain was unbearable, but the realization was worse. If I stayed, he would simply repeat the violation until I was completely broken. My survival depended on ending this. I started looking at the meat knife in the kitchen drawer, not as a tool for a horrible escape, but as a symbol of the sharpness I needed to cut him out of my life forever. After that night, a shift occurred deep within me. The terrified girl was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating resolve. I knew words were useless. No one in Harvest Creek would believe a whisper against Silas Sterling, the esteemed merchant. I needed undeniable proof. That morning, as the sun painted the Oklahoma sky with a deceptive pink hue, I was in agony, but my mind was clearer than ever. I dragged myself to the basin and saw my reflection. A split lip, a cut on my forehead, and finger-shaped bruises darkening on my throat. These were my witnesses. I waited until Silas left to open the store, his usual routine, dressing in a heavy, long-sleeved dress and a thick coat to conceal the bruises on my arms and back. I slipped out of the house. I walked the dusty road to Mrs. Porter's house 3 streets away, feeling the sun on my face for the first time in months. Her house was the only one with a telephone. My voice trembled as I asked Mrs. Porter for a moment of privacy. I quickly found the number for the county law office, a number I knew my mother had kept hidden. "Sheriff Graham, this is Alara Sterling, Silas's daughter. I need your help. I need you and 2 deputies at my house at exactly 12 noon. I will serve you the proof of the crime." The silence on the line was heavy, but I held firm, demanding absolute secrecy. With the deed done, I walked straight to Mr. Johnson's market, using the small emergency fund Silas kept in a tin. I bought the ingredients for his favorite meal, a rich, hearty beef stew simmered with root vegetables, the ultimate comfort food. "Making a special lunch today, Alara?" Mr. Johnson asked, wrapping the meat. "The most special meal of my life," I replied, forcing a smile. I returned home and set about preparing my trap. I chopped, stirred, and seasoned the stew, which soon filled the house with a deceptive, mouth-watering aroma. Around 11, Silas stumbled in, face puffy from the previous night's drinking. He sniffed the air and smiled, a repulsive, satisfied look. "Smells like you finally learned your lesson," he slurred, interpreting the delicious meal as a sign of my complete submission. "It was about time you understood your place." I swallowed my nausea, offering a weak, "Yes, Father, you are always right." I set the old pine table with care, placing the steaming bowl of stew in front of his usual chair. It was 11:57 a.m. I sat opposite him, my coat buttoned high, watching the second hand sweep towards noon. He was halfway through his favorite stew, chewing with slow, bovine pleasure, when the clock on the kitchen wall struck 12. 1 minute later, there was a sound at the front door, a sound that was not the tentative knock of a customer, but a sharp, authoritative rap. The game was over.
Elis dropped his spoon, his satisfied expression instantly replaced by a scowl. "Who is that?" he growled, already annoyed by the interruption to his meal. "I'll see who it is," I murmured, rising from the table, my legs shaking with adrenaline. I opened the door. There stood Sheriff Graham, his face serious and unreadable, flanked by 2 uniformed deputies. "Good afternoon, Alara," the sheriff said, touching the brim of his hat. "We've come to follow up on your call." Silas shot up from his chair. "My call? Graham, what is the meaning of this intrusion? I am eating!" He bellowed, his voice losing its convivial market tone. "Oscar Sterling," the sheriff stated, walking slowly into the house, his gaze never leaving my father. "We are here to investigate a serious complaint of abuse and assault." "Abuse? By whom? This is ridiculous. Who would make such a preposterous accusation?" Silas's voice was a frantic mix of denial and fury. I stepped forward, pulling the heavy wool coat and the long-sleeved dress from my shoulders, letting them drop to the floor. I stood there, under the stark light of the kitchen window, for the sheriff and the deputies to see. The evidence was laid bare. The yellowing purple fingerprints of my father's hand circling my throat, the split, crusted wound on my lip, the angry cut on my forehead. I turned slightly, exposing the dark, crisscrossing marks the belt buckle had left on my back and arms. "This girl has been doing her chores and serving me all morning, Sheriff," I said, my voice steady, no longer trembling. "I made sure she was covered, so her injuries would be fresh evidence for you to see." Sheriff Graham looked at Silas, then back at me, his eyes filled with horror he couldn't hide. "Finger marks on a throat do not happen from a fall, Oscar," he said, pulling the handcuffs from his belt. It was then that Silas understood. He looked at the half-eaten stew at the table and finally at me, his face contorted with the most chilling hatred I had ever seen. You betrayed me!" he screamed, lunging. The deputies moved instantly, tackling him. As they forced his hands behind his back, securing the cuffs, I simply replied, "I didn't betray you, Father. I saved myself, and I saved every other girl you might have hurt." Silas was led away screaming curses, leaving the scent of stale whiskey and a nearly finished meal. I stood there, amidst the ruins of my childhood, knowing the cycle of pain ended in that very kitchen. I married my beloved Thomas a few years later, and together we built a life of genuine love and safety. Our children and grandchildren are raised here in this peaceful home, and they grow up knowing they are loved, cherished, and protected. Never forget, dear friends, that no one, not even family, has the right to hurt you. You have the right to fight for your peace and for the beautiful life you deserve. Final rehook. I took my fear and forged it into courage. The same hands that cooked a meal to end a nightmare now bake pies for a happy family. If I, a small girl from the dust of Harvest Creek, could stand up to my greatest tormentor and build a life out of ashes. What darkness are you ready to face today?